Hello there, John Cuturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As usual, thank you to everyone who supports my work, be you a client who allows me the privilege of entering into your life and helping you to achieve your goals, or a listener and or supporter of the podcast. To all of you, thank you for allowing me the privilege of living my vision every day. Today I'd like to discuss the fallacy of the good old days, the idea that certain people seem to hold dear that the world was a better place in the past, be they people who actually lived in those times or people who wish they lived in those times. I'm not giving advice here. I'm not a historian. I'm not someone who has memorized a large number of statistics, and I'm certainly not somebody who lived very long ago, so I can't testify to how the world was then compared to now. So take this as a perspective, but it's a discussion that we need to have because it also reveals something extremely important about the way the human mind works, of which we need to be aware if we're to be the best that we can be as a society. Now, undoubtedly, we are living in troubled times in various ways, and I've discussed some of the ways in which we're living in troubled times in various episodes of my program. And ultimately, we do need to address the problems that we face now. But to say that the world was ultimately a better place back then than it is now is something of a logical fallacy for a number of reasons. Humanity has always been inherently flawed, and the human mind is not perfect. And even though a mind only exists within the realm of one person, society consists of the minds of billions of people. And so the flaws of the mind, if shared by enough people, ultimately become society's flaws. The world has always had its problems, and over time, human nature and the way the mind works hasn't evolved as much as we like to think it has. We're still subject to the same errors in the way that we process information and make decisions. The problem is now that as the generations pass, those same cognitive flaws simply lead to people making different types of mistakes. Something that we need to understand is that we make attribution errors. In other words, we make mistakes about the causes of certain events, certain phenomena. And one way to possibly explain this is via evolutionary theory. If we were to be so aware of our flaws as people that we were to constantly question them, we would have so much anxiety that we wouldn't be able to concentrate on living our lives. And naturally, as individuals, we'll always know more about ourselves and our own perspectives than we will about other people's perspectives. We'll always know more about the time in which we live because we're here to witness it than we do about other times in history. Dealing with one's own flaws is extremely uncomfortable for the most self-aware of people. So for people who have less than ideal levels of self-awareness, you can imagine just how comfortable it would be qualitatively. So what we tend to do is we tend to blame other sources for the problems that the world is experiencing, rather than questioning what our own role is. This could also create what you could call the fallacy of the good nowadays, in which the world is inevitably a better place now than it was in the past. We say, I couldn't have contributed to the problems that we face now, other people did. Because in my generation, in my day, we didn't do this. We didn't do what people did now to cause these problems. Or the generations back in past times were to blame for these problems, but my generation's better. We wouldn't let that happen. And we tend to seek simple explanations. Life was better in those days because people were less lazy, because people worked harder, because people were more willing to sacrifice, because people were more considerate of others, because of this, because of that. We never look to ourselves and ask ourselves, as time went on, was I acting in the same way that the rest of society was in order to cause the problems that I believe are happening now? In reality, the combination of human minds and their respective flaws in the way we process information and make decisions that every person has and that I've discussed extensively in my program has ultimately led to societal problems because we function not just within ourselves but within our collective, and we do tend to change our behaviours in response to how other people function. Our mind often functions in ways of which we're not even aware that differs based on what we observe other people doing. Therefore, if we perceive that a large number of people over time have been responsible for a problem, the likelihood is that we were also responsible for it in some way. Also remember that the nature of power seeking has always essentially been the same. People who seek power often, if not always, do so because they have an unhealthy desire for control. They will engage in extremely dishonest and evil tactics in order to control other people, and often what we believe is based on what we have been conditioned to believe by people who are powerful. The fact that people seek power for those reasons hasn't changed that much. So a number of periods in history could be said to have had both benefits and weaknesses, but overall, we can't say that life is inevitably better now than it was 100 years ago, and we can't say that life was inevitably better 100 years ago than it is now. Now, as I've stated, I'm not a historian, and I didn't live in some of the periods to which I'm going to be theoretically referring. I'm not somebody who's memorized a large number of statistics. Here is a primer, though, about some of the information that I've discussed with other people, some of the perspectives that I've collected from people who did live in past times, and what different people believe the benefits and costs were of those times against present times, to give you perspective about how essentially every period in history has had its flaws. Here are some ideas for your consideration. Even if we're just talking about Australian society, people will often attest, and there are ways that we can potentially verify this, that there were certain values held in past times that we don't hold nowadays. Some say our economy was in a better state, that we were more productive, that the quality of service that people received when dealing with businesses was better, that people were more considerate of what they did for their customers, that there were more job opportunities, and that businesses were more willing to train people who were entering into business for the first time rather than expecting them to have tertiary qualifications. And tertiary qualifications, some would argue, were based on outcomes rather than just their self-contained benefit. Some say there was more opportunity for growth in work, in which people sometimes graduated from their secondary education, entered into the workforce at an entry-level role, and then were able to progress to jobs of high status purely through on-the-job training. Now, if that's true, I would argue that that's inevitably better because, as I've said previously, education cannot replicate experience, something that I'm going to discuss more in the future. On the topic of work ethic, many people will attest that products were made better back then, and a lot of people have old goods that are still functioning to this day. People will often attest to how major assets were often more subject to repair when there was a problem with them than simple replacement, stating that we live in a throwaway society nowadays. People would say that people engage with each other more, that neighbourhoods looked out for each other, people in the neighbourhood would look out for other residents, people were more willing to talk to each other. Some would say that people were less willing to play games, although that in itself is questionable. Perhaps we just play different games nowadays, but we certainly throughout human history have always played mind games for our own benefit. We weren't so caught up in technology. Because of the absence of technology, we engaged more in healthy activities. Children played outside, they made friends with each other. People played sport with their neighbours. People were more willing to have conversations with people in the street when they saw each other. There was more of a focus on the collective order and collectively watching for other people's welfare. Those were some of the positives of those days. What were some of the negatives? Well, human history has been ruled in some periods by an attitude of animalism and biological determinism. What this means is, in the past, there wasn't as much nuanced consideration of people's psychology and what could potentially be quite harmful to them. We tended to treat ourselves and each other as if we were just like every other species of animal and functioning purely off instinct. People are born, they grow up, they have a duty to follow what they see, they have a duty to conform. If they're a man, they have a duty to seek power, to seek a high status job, and to be the head of a family. If they're a woman, they have a duty to want to be a housewife and to look after children and to be reliant on their husband. All of these strict rules of conformity were considered to be common sense or reason. We argued that the only way to have a functioning society is to simply be blindly conforming. We were essentially told we are subjects of our biology. We are subjects of a very strict set of rules, and nature invented these rules. Now, as I'm going to discuss in the future, while technically speaking, a certain number of norms, a certain amount of conformity in society is healthy and necessary for society to function well, life is not that simple. Not everybody of a given group is always going to want to or be appropriate for particular roles that society assumes are just set out for them by nature. People have a right to explore. People have a right to seek their own activity and pursuits in life. And just because they're not conforming, it doesn't mean that ultimately their lives are not going to be constructive. We've begun to accept that there are a number of ways to live a constructive life. This type of authoritarianism was not fair on people, and it ultimately would lead to resentment. And resentment can ultimately lead to unrest that ironically could lead society to be less ordered. So there needs to be a balance between conformity and individualism. It was also more acceptable for certain communities to uphold fewer rights for some groups than others. It was okay at some periods in history for women not to be able to vote. It was okay for women not to be able to own property. It was not okay for women not to consent to sex. It was considered a man's right to have sex with his wife whenever he wanted. it was considered, if you'd love somebody of the same sex as yourself, if you're attracted to them, then you were considered a deviant, and that was illegal. There was no consideration for the fact that just because something is different doesn't make it bad, and that society can still function with more consideration to the rights and the equity of other groups. Now, many of these problems have been addressed in the present day. There are now legal protections for people in vulnerable groups or people who are not part of what society traditionally considered to be the power elite. It's largely illegal to refuse to hire someone based on any factor other than their suitability for the job and not their group membership, such as their gender, their race, or their religion. There's now more consideration of individual merit, so that people who previously would have been declined jobs, like people who are disabled or mentally ill, are now able to access work and pursue their own aspirations. There's more consideration of some individual freedoms. Now, if you love someone of the same sex or you love somebody of a different race, the law can't stop you from pursuing a relationship with that person. And if you, as a member of a vulnerable group, have a crime committed against you, then law enforcement is charged with the duty to investigate that act in just as stringent a fashion as if the act was committed against somebody who was considered to be a member of the power elite. Whether that happens or not is a different story, but the expectation is there. Often what happens also with each successive generation is that parents often want to be better at parenting than their parents. Again, whether that happens or not is up for debate, but it is a common point of discussion amongst parents. Those are the positives, but what are some of the negatives? Some form of elitism are being subdued, other forms of elitism have developed. For example, from what I've seen, again, I can't attest to this in every case, but in many fields, there are fewer job opportunities because companies are not willing to train their staff. They're not willing to give people experience. They only want to hire experienced people. University and tertiary education are seen as superior forms of education, and often people are persuaded to pay for qualifications without being taught the value of there being a specific job outcome attached to that qualification. A lot of fields in which on-the-job training would probably be more effective will only hire people with qualifications. And because those people have only received a theoretical education rather than a practical education, in reality they may not be as well qualified, even though theoretically they may be more qualified than they would have been in the past. The emphasis on university also keeps people who may have the skill to perform certain jobs but don't have the money to study for them out of the market, thereby limiting their ability to fulfill their aspirations. Another problem that we may have now is breeding reliance on authority and being willing to surrender personal freedoms for a false sense of security. I won't speak too much on this as it's a whole topic in and of itself, but it's something that I will certainly discuss in the future. So essentially, these periods in history have all involved specific ideas about what you should be free to do and what you shouldn't be free to do, and often people's freedoms are unjustifiably compromised in the name of reason or common sense. Everyone likes to think that their sympathy with certain authority on some matters but not on others is just common sense. So in conclusion, in every period of history, there have been positives and there have been negatives, and ultimately, in every period of history, people have had to suffer because of the negatives. There were no good old days, there were just times in which certain issues weren't as apparent. But as time passes, what we simply do is swap some mistakes for other mistakes, but humanity overall has not stopped making mistakes and probably never will. We'll always have the tendency to blame others and never look to ourselves and ask ourselves, how am I contributing to the problems that are manifesting in society? And what can I potentially do to help solve them? And that's something that, unless people drastically improve, is going to plague the human race for all of time. But you, if you're listening right now, don't have to be that way. You can choose to step outside of that conditioning. You can choose to look at yourself in the mirror and ask, what can I do to contribute to society so that I'm not part of the problem? It can be difficult, but it's not impossible. And you don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders to be a good person. Being responsible involves effort, but it's not impossible effort. We all can make a difference, no matter how small it may be. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, never take what you see on the internet as advice. Always seek advice from a professional if you need it. If you're listening, I'd love to hear from you. If you have any ideas about what you'd like to hear discussed on the program, or you'd like to be a collaborator, or you'd like to be a guest, please contact me. I'd love to hear from you. And until next time, take care.